Good morning, everyone on the US East Coast, and good afternoon if you've called in from somewhere further east. I will pass the word straight over to my boss, our director for the Global Practice for Urban Resilience and Land, Bernice van Bronckhorst, to introduce this morning's session. Bernice, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Niels. And also from my end, really good morning and good afternoon or good evening. I'm really pleased to have you all join this event this morning, where we're going to be discussing how to design inclusive and accessible early warning systems. Just by way of a little bit of PR, this event is being sponsored by the World Bank's Resilience and Disaster Risk Management Global Solutions Group and the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery. Sorry, can you hear me? GFDRR. I hope you can all hear me. Yes, okay, very good. So again, really delighted to see all of you here today to talk about this topic, which is really of critical importance to the World Bank's development agenda. And I have to say, actually really close to my heart as well. As the team knows, I always talk about inclusion. My early days in the bank, actually many, many years ago, too many to count, I actually started working on issues of gender. That's how I came into the bank. So I'm really pleased to see how far this agenda has come over the last few decades. And also really to see how we are not just looking at gender issues in women and girls, but also really looking at other disadvantaged groups like persons of disability, but also LGBTQ communities, etc., that often, of course, as we all know, really suffer disproportionately in disaster situations. So, issues of safe access to shelters, or increased challenges in recovering more swiftly due to less access to financial resources, etc. So really, one of the big drivers of the variations in disaster impacts is really also due to access or lack of access to information and inclusive communication. At the same time, we really are looking at an opportunity at the moment, I think, as the UN and the WMO have set the goal of ensuring that every person is covered by an early warning system by 2027. And that really means that we have, to work very hard to both ensure that these new early warning systems that are still yet to be established are inclusive, as well as, of course, that the existing systems really take account of all these different groups, disadvantages because of gender, disabilities, sexual orientation, also just other types of inequalities that we see in different societies. So the World Bank really sees the implementation of inclusive early warning systems as a key to successful development, by saving lives, livelihoods, and economic gains, and really ensuring that we meet the needs of everyone. So this is, of course, easier said than done. It's very challenging. It takes time. It takes effort. It requires collaboration with local stakeholders, with local partners, really to ensure representation of vulnerable groups that often don't have a voice, if we don't pay specific and special attention to them. So it's really a great time to have this report coming out. It's, lots of, great ideas and lessons learned. So over the next hour, we have the pleasure of welcoming one of the co-authors of the report, Dr. Karina Fernley from UCL, University College London, as well as colleagues from the bank, from USAID, and from UN Women, who all have tremendous experience in designing inclusive early warning systems. So with that, I'm sure that we'll be hearing super interesting perspectives, and hopefully we'll have time for a really stimulating discussion as well. So really with that, let me hand it back to you, Niels, so that we can get going with what we really all came to hear for, not to hear from me, but to hear from our wonderful presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernice, and for the introduction and this topic for this morning. It looks to be an exciting exchange. It is a relatively short time. We're probably not going to have enough time for a deep Q&A, but if you do have a few questions, you're listening in, you've logged on this morning, please put them in the chat. We'll try to see how many of them we can get at in the end. But I now want to turn to Dr. Carina Fearnley, introduce Dr. Fearnley. She's the Associate Professor of Science and Technology Studies and the founder and director of the Warning Research Centre at the University College of London. Dr. Fearnley is an interdisciplinary researcher who draws on expertise around scientific uncertainty, risk and complexity to improve natural hazard early warning systems. Dr. Fearnley, in collaboration with other colleagues from University College of London and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery's Inclusive Disaster Risk Management and Gender Equality Initiative, and our Global Hydromet program, have co-authored the recently released note on good practices and entry points for designing inclusive and accessible warning systems. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fearnley. Dr. Fearnley, over to you, please.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So today I really want to take you through how we can design inclusive and accessible warning systems and why that's important, and specifically address what are good practices and entry points. So we can see this image here. We often think about inclusivity and accessibility about being something that's to do with a different group, some other groups of people, maybe somewhere else in the world. But of course, it's an issue for all of us, for everybody in warning systems. And quite often we think about inclusivity and accessibility, like the boy there is in a wheelchair, but actually there's lots of hidden disabilities or illnesses. So for example, the teacher might have a chronic illness that requires certain medication if she was to be evacuated. Some of these girls might have visual or hearing impairments, or indeed there might be levels of racial issues or gang issues that we just can't even see that are pervading this issue. So with my co-authors, Rebecca Yore, Professor Ilan Kelman and Professor Maureen Fordham, we were asked to write a report on how can we actually enhance warning inclusivity. And so we wanted to use very specific examples and key lessons to make this a real actionable process. And we did this through two methods. So firstly, we did a literature review of peer-reviewed scientific publications and using various organisational documents and reports that had been published on the topic. And then secondly, we conducted a number of interviews and consultations with stakeholders in various regions globally. And that included, as you can see on the slide here, World Bank team leads, independent consultants, academics, NGO personnel and private sector. Namahi ala tamulat fi anemat al-andihari. Now that was my attempt of speaking Arabic, and I'm not sure if many of you can speak Arabic, but if we're being given information, whatever that information is, in a language we can't understand, that's not helpful in a warning system. So we need to think about inclusivity, including the fact that Arabic is written from right to left. So what is inclusivity? What does that actually mean? Well, what we're doing it for is we want to help save more lives, preserve livelihoods, and prevent great economic losses. And on top of that, what we want to do is generate inclusivity to have equitable growth and prosperity in the long term. And this is really important. So what we need to do is make sure that when we're implementing warning systems and we're designing them, we need to respond to everyone's characteristics. Now, these can be things that are physical, mental, or cognitive, such as their sex, gender, sexuality, age, race, ethnicity, caste, and disabilities. But it also can be religion, language, as we've just seen, communication forms, and precarity. This could be people who are undetained, people who are undocumented, homeless, or asylum status. And so what's really important is that we tailor our approaches so that we can use these warnings to target these different groups who may need different requirements. Also, when we think about inclusivity, we often think about a single characteristic, someone's race, for example, disability, but in reality, what we see is multi-cross-cutting characteristics that are often very complex, and this is intersectional. So we can have someone who, for example, is gay, might have visual impairments and is of a certain religion that's not part of the location that they're living or they've been persecuted for. So there's all sorts of issues here that we need to think about than just a single issue. We have to think about these multi-cross-cutting characteristics. So if I just get the next slide coming up here, why does inclusivity and warnings matter? Well, here's the report that's just been published. It matters because it's part of the Sendai framework, with target G focusing on increasing the availability of and access to multi-hazard early warning systems. We also had the Early Warning for All initiative launched in March 22 by UN Secretary General, so that every person on the planet is covered by an early warning system in the next 5 years. So what that means is that as we are increasing and expanding our warning systems globally, as we are enhancing those systems and improving them, it is absolutely critical that we make sure that they are inclusive for those who are marginalized or require adaptive or specific warning messages. So this is the time to be really thinking about this. Now, when we think about designing inclusive warnings, we think about it being people-centered. So this is really enabling the people and the individuals and communities to prepare for and respond to emergencies in a way that's appropriate to them. And as part of that, that is usually done through community-based early warning systems. Multiple hazards can happen at the same time, so we need to have a multi-hazard, impact-based warning system, and this can be hazards that are secondary, a cascading hazard situation, or simultaneous hazards. And providing information about, well, what does this hazard mean? How is it going to impact a certain community or group of individuals? And then we want our messages and warnings to be integrated, that bring the needs and capabilities of users together. And often that's done with the threat of multiple hazards, which makes things more complicated. But the Common Alerting Protocol, for example, can tailor messages for different languages in different regions and different areas, providing some of that integrated flexibility. We then also need to make sure that our warnings are connected. So you can see on the right here, we've got this diagram with the 4 elements of what the early warning system is. We've got risk knowledge, monitoring and warning, warning dissemination and communication, and response capability. And these also make up the 4 pillars in the Early Warning for All initiative. And what's been proven as really important by a study by Carolina Garcia and myself is that issues like local context, flexibility, that are so critical, the links that bring these things together, such as good governance, preparedness, accountability, increasing participation. So we need to make sure our warnings are connected. And then finally, intersectional, of course, seeing beyond a single characteristic and considering multiple factors, that someone may not hear a warning, may not be registered on a list to receive a warning, or they may have many other possible constraints. This is known as taking an intersectional. So here we have had an alert going off, and you're being given some information. Now, I'm sure some of you are struggling to see this, and that's kind of the point. So quite often sirens will go off in emergency. If you don't know what it means, or it's not specified in a siren, then you need to have some other information. And if that information is written, it's very difficult for people who are visually impaired to actually access this. So this is one of the case studies that we'll come back to shortly. No, I haven't hit the mute button. I'm making the point that if you're deaf, equally having a siren is no good. So all sorts of groups and charities have got together, for example, the Emergency Awareness and Readiness Services for Deaf and Hard of Hearing have taken equipment, standard equipment that exists and is already operational, and made adaptive tools so that people can have vibrative alerts and colour alerts so that they know what's going on, what type of warning it is, and so on. So based on the literature, we know that we can enhance inclusivity by making sure that we have a number of different factors that help us design inclusive and accessible multi-hazard warning systems. These are long-term social processes, so making sure that warnings are part of the everyday social fabric of our society, using multiple channels and making sure that warnings are clear, transparent and credible. And this also encompasses not just relying on technology, because we know technology can fail at times. We also need to make sure the warnings are relevant to everyone, covering a range of timeframes and spatial coverage. We need to connect all governance levels, including local, national and international. And this is particularly complicated when hazards are international and there might be conflicting information. So it's thinking about how can we make that connection work. We need to integrate across the different vulnerabilities so that they can respond, understand how they're going to respond to multi-hazard sequences and cascading events. And then we also need to extend beyond the warning dissemination to look at damage prevention, mitigation actions, and response conditions to make sure that people can actually have the capacity to act. And then, of course, very importantly, the facilitating of early action and anticipatory action so that we can contribute to reducing inequalities and inequities regardless of the hazard. So how are we going to implement these? So the report presents in 4 different ways the 4 different elements of the warning systems, looking at how we can implement these measures and what are the particular entry points. So the first one focuses on the first element, which is the disaster risk knowledge. And here the entry point is really about using participatory approaches to data generation and weather information. So this is about really knowing who has the needs that they have. So, for example, you can see here, this is a Royal Borough of Kingston in London badge here. If you have a disability, you will be registered on the Educational Needs and Disability Register. So that will be a way that the authorities can make sure that you are accounted for in certain requirements. However, if we look at the sprawling Dadaab camp in Kenya, as the example is portrayed from the World Bank example in the report, we can see that it's very complicated. We've got people moving in and out of the camp. They may not wish to specify their religion. They've just been, persecuted in another country and they're coming to seek refuge. There's all sorts of complications. So in the report, what we do is we provide a table with each of the different gaps that we've identified in disaster risk knowledge and given some actions. There's a whole load of them here, so I'm just picking one from each of them. But the idea that we don't have sufficient data on sex, gender, disability, and this could be for very good and important reasons around safety, is to make sure that we try and systematically collect disaggregated data on marginalised and vulnerable groups such as women, children, elderly, persons with disability and various minority groups, and that we might do this in a certain way that creates trust and a long-term relationship. It might be that we do that through heads of different groups or communities, for example. If we look at the second element at detection, observation, monitoring, analysis and forecasting, here we're talking about diversity, collaboration and commitment. So we talk in the report about an example from Brazil, but a really good example that most of you will be familiar with is the Fiji Women's Weather Watch. And of course, this was implemented in 2004 following a whole series of storms, and it was recognised that women didn't have a voice in the preparedness and the understanding. So a group of women were taken and trained up and liaised with the weather scientists and meteorologists and feed that information back into their community, enabling a much broader engagement, not just with other women, but with children, the elderly and communities in a way that wasn't done before. So it's really important that we need to make sure that all the different stakeholders, in this case women, are being involved and they're part of that implementation of the warning system, the operation of it. They have a sense of ownership and they have that training. So how do we implement? So we want to make sure with warning dissemination and communication, the third element, that we have communication redundancy, adaptability and creativity. And for example, I want to show you just a couple of seconds of a video from Haiti's resilience program that was also funded by the World Bank. Here it's about using a creative way of trying to get people to know and understand what is a warning, what are the key issues and what they should do. So just take a quick listen to this. sorry to cut that off. Lovely song, but it's really illustrating this point that if we're having limited access or understanding of hazards, or even like they can't access the video on YouTube, if other people are singing that song, they're gaining that information about what the issues, where they need to go in a crisis, or where someone or some place is in danger, it's also very useful. So the fourth and final element is on preparedness and response capacity. And so the entry point here is building on national and local systems. So the National Cyclone Risk Mitigation Project Part 2 in India, here the World Bank came in and was building on existing systems. And it was certainly found that across India, there had been a number of cyclones where actually 70% of deaths were women in the Tamil Nadu state. Now, this is obviously partly because women were staying at home in the household. They weren't part of that process of disaster planning and being able to evacuate. So the intervention here was to create women community leaders and to create an even divide of training of men and women, girls and boys, all ages, and a task force so everyone was trained and understood what they need to do. And indeed, if we look at cyclone shelters that have been built more recently, we can see that actually they can have all sorts of functions that operate all day, every day outside of a storm. And this makes people familiar with that environment, and it makes sure they're maintained and they feel safe. So in this case, in Bangladesh, this shelter is used for a school and day clinic, providing very great and much needed facilities in a well-designed building. So again, this is about getting women in decision-making processes. It's about building on the current infrastructure to develop and progress that area and give them facilities that they wouldn't otherwise have. And this builds on the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So in this table is a summary in the report that kind of pulls all this together. But what I want to say in conclusion is that there's three really key points here to take away. And the first is that we must engage diverse communities and stakeholders from the beginning. And this requires continual engagement processes that are financed from the start all the way through for people and organisations to fulfil their own warning needs without exclusion or inhibiting others. The second is to integrate iteration and adaptive learning. And this can be done by the people and the organisations who are applying the warnings, so to build trust and credibility for this long-term warning process that becomes part of everyone's daily lives and governance practices. And the third is to support initiatives and activities that create an enabling environment. So establishing good practices, the entry points that we've looked at today, and comparable data, whilst also recognising there are going to be limitations such as safe data collection, transferability and scaling. But what we do know is that the evidence shows that taking practical approaches to inclusion in warnings has a better outcome and reaches more groups than a one-size-fits-all model, which is really important. So we'd like to thank very much the team at GFDRR for supporting us with writing the report, for financing it. This is just a little bio and photo of us authors, so please do take a look at us. At the Warning Research Centre, we have a number of different outputs looking at various aspects of warnings. We work with a number of collaborators and partners, and we have a range of social media that promotes news, reports, webinars and events. And finally, our big event that we've just started advertising is for a conference, 3-day conference dedicated to looking at how we can create effective warnings for all in September in London. So we hope very much to see some of you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fearnley. This was absolutely fascinating. I want to make sure that you all had a chance to look at the link that Zoe put in the chat, because that's the link to the report that Dr. Fearnley was talking about. So there you can dig further into a lot of this information, including on how to, which I think is very important for us development professionals on the call. And I want to turn to our panel, first to Masha. And I would like to ask you, Masha, to tell us a little bit about your experience working on early warning systems in the Caribbean. Masha.
Okay. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you all for inviting me to join this event where I guess even more than sharing my experience, I get to learn more from other colleagues on how the topic of inclusion in early warning system can be approached. And huge thanks to GFDRR for championing this topic through the research, through practice. To answer your question, I think the most recent experience come from the regional project in the Caribbean that we've just about to finalize. The project was focused on strengthening multi-hazard early warning systems and services in the region and supporting regional and national agencies in this process. And the project was funded by the Cruise Initiative. So as part of this called Cruise Caribbean project, we have collaborated with the regional hydromet and DRM agencies, CMH, CMO, CDMA, with other development partners such as WMO, UNDRR, to better understand and articulate the impact of the natural hazards, and also setting up sort of like a guiding principles that should help the region to strengthen multi-hazard early warning system and use it to inform anticipatory actions to protect people. And in the process, we often refer to the term people-centered, and I guess I remember reading the report also focuses on people-centered approach. So in fact, that actually is inclusive aspect. So inclusive and self-sustaining regional impact-based multi-hazard early warning system that ensure participation from gender groups, community leaders, vulnerable groups, and private sector, because somehow private sector sometimes also fall under the vulnerability category. The overall Caribbean region is committed to the goals of having inclusive multi-hazard early warning services. I recently came across, I think it was like a midterm review of Sendai framework that actually says that the region is at a turning point towards addressing multi-hazard early warning services through a strong regional mechanism, through development of gender-sensitive model national legislation. They have a good understanding of the mapping of the regional actors, so there's like a number of activities that were supported through the Cruise Caribbean project, including the early warning checklists that allow you actually understand who your vulnerable groups are and how they can be incorporated in the process. But still, the report did mention that the region is slightly behind on their gender inclusiveness and in general inclusiveness towards people-centered of multi-hazard early warning services. So yet more things to be done. There's been a lot done under the project and during the diagnostic, but the kind of like the challenges of moving from early warning to early action is still there. And I guess the recommendations of the reports that were just presented, all of them would come handy for the region. And I think the challenge would be to kind of think how to put them in practice, including through the World Bank project. But I guess I'll stop here and not going to go into challenges at this point. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Masha. Rahel, I want to turn to you as well to hear briefly from you how UN Women approach this topic.
Yes, thank you so much, colleagues, and thank you also on behalf of UN Women for this opportunity to be on this panel, and this has been already such an enriching discussion. So basically, UN Women's engagement in this space is based on the fact that women are on average at greater disaster and climate risk. And this is amongst other factors, of course, also due to a lack of timely and relevant information about imminent hazards through early warning systems, which, when they exist, are most of the time not gender responsive. So one of the main challenges to inclusive disaster and climate risk reduction and resilience are, of course, barriers to engagement for women and women's organizations, as well as a lack of coordination between gender and DRR and climate stakeholders. So really, gender, DRR, and climate stakeholders working very much in silos. And UN Women in our DRR work, we basically aim to enable targeted action that enhances collaboration and cooperation between all actors involved in this area, so gender, climate, and disaster risk reduction, focusing also on bringing non-traditional disaster risk reduction actors to the table, including ministries for women, and we partner up with grassroots women's organizations and organizations representing women with disabilities. And on an annual basis, we work with a network of about 400 women's organizations, 400 to 500 women's organizations worldwide. We also help build the capacity of women's organizations to shape early warning systems and help build adequate gender-responsive communication and outreach systems to support inclusive early warning systems. And we are currently active in this area in 61 countries. A third of these are actually small island development states. In many of these small island development states, we work through programmatic presence. And of course, we also aim to increase focus on gender-responsive early warning in disaster risk reduction and resilience policy frameworks, another area which I think we all need to focus on very strongly as we advance the work or continue to advance the work on early warning systems. Now, at UN Women, we have something which is called the Women's Resilience to Disasters Program. It's our signature initiative in disaster risk reduction, and it contributes to closing gender gaps in disaster risk reduction and resilience, including in early warning systems. And we promote the explicit consideration of the gender dimensions of risk, impacts, needs, capacities, and the ability to meaningfully participate, lead, and influence decision-making in all elements of DRR and resilience, including, of course, early warning systems. And let me just conclude by saying that UN Women also recently joined the advisory panel of the Early Warnings for All initiative to ensure that everyone on Earth is protected by early warnings by 2027. And in UN Women specifically, we will be working to advance and mainstream gender equality and women's empowerment across the 4 pillars of the initiative, in particular by leveraging existing partnerships, programs, and activities to increase women's ability to shape and access early warning systems and take action for more effective and inclusive prevention, preparedness, resilience, and recovery. And also acknowledging in this context the very important cooperation and work with GFDRR and the World Bank. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ryle. Cecin, our third panelist, could you share a bit with us about the USAID-supported projects that relates to inclusive early warning systems?
Thanks so much, Niels. It's a great pleasure to be with many friends and colleagues in this forum launching the critical report on inclusive early warning systems. And thank you, GFDRR and others, bringing this issue. It is timely, as Bernice said, given that early warning for all activities are just starting. USAID has a long history of supporting end-to-end early warning systems globally, and we are committed to doing more. At COP26, President Biden announced his emergency action plan for adaptation and resilience. One of the core pillars of this initiative responds directly to UN Secretary General's call on early warning for all by committing the US government to partnering with countries to advance their capacity on end-to-end early warning systems. USAID committed to inclusive development that is articulated in our official guidance on inclusive development and serves as a framework for applying various USAID policies and guidance to promote the inclusion of marginalized and underrepresented groups. Examples include our disability, the gender equality and female empowerment, the youth and development policies, as well as LGBTQI+ vision for action. In addition to our policies, USAID climate strategy includes a specific target to achieve systemic changes that increase meaningful participation and active leadership of indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth, and other marginalized and or underrepresented groups in climate action, including climate-related disaster risk reduction and early warning systems. In addition, these are the background basically for integrating inclusion in all our programs that we support in USAID. We also support programs specifically focused on marginalized groups to advance their participation in decision-making in 4 pillars on end-to-end early warning systems. I would like to give an example. We supported the Youth Emergency Action Committee's program, or as known as St. Patrick's Rangers in Jamaica. The program aimed to transform at-risk youth in disaster preparedness into disaster preparedness leaders. The program targeted most hazard-prone and marginalized neighborhoods in the inner city, Kingston, Jamaica. By joining the St. Patrick's Rangers, young people learn how to help communities plan for and respond to hurricanes, administered first aid when needed, mapped out evacuation routes, and set up emergency shelters. They also help people repair their homes after storm hits. Youth that was engaged in the program through an edutainment approach, education plus entertainment approach. A great video was illustrated with our colleagues who wrote, the authors of the report. Teen wrote musics, created skits, and performed them to raise community awareness about disaster preparedness while simultaneously learning life-saving skills. Rap music in particular was a big hit with the group coming up with lyrics such as "Send in the broom and shovel, don't bring the violence, please leave the trouble." Youth involved in the program stated that their lives changed when they joined the St. Patrick Rangers. The program built the confidence of the young people, and people helped them going back to school, some of them going back to school. Because the program was so successful, we expanded the implementation to Dominican Republic, St. Lucia, and Grenada in the region. These illustrate simple activities. They engage youth and other marginalized population, has many multiple returns and benefit to communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Marcia, I want to turn back to you and ask you if you could share, based on your experience, what are some of the enabling factors you have seen or encountered on early warning system projects that you've been involved in that were socially inclusive?
Thanks. So enabling factors, sometimes, yeah, it's kind of like the other side of the challenges coin. So I have to say that I hope that there will be more sort of cases that I will be able to share from the Caribbean, from the Central America. I think the bank is really has a vast portfolio, which is very well presented in the report. Another kudos to the team of doing a very thorough work. I think enabling factors could come from a number of things, from kind of changing also our perception about a lot of things as we go along, to the practicalities level of what inclusive early warning systems are. I think one of the things that we've noticed in our project is when we try to target vulnerability. We evolved from kind of thinking of vulnerability in a very static way, like infrastructural vulnerability, to a very dynamic and fluid. We learned to understand that it's a very fluid substance. So vulnerability really changes from not just day to day, literally from morning to evening. So vulnerability profile of one person can be different. So how do we incorporate that in our early warning services? And I very much liked what Karina said in the beginning. Like we tend to think about vulnerable groups as something that has like very clear definition. Once we define this, we'll know how to deal with it. We're all vulnerable groups. Like like my action as a person as a single person would be quite different. My vulnerabilities would be quite different compared to me being with a kid. So accounting for that and giving tools and giving possible actions and scenarios, I think, is one of the important factors that we need to kind of like think how we can incorporate. That sort of brings me to the next point, is the time. So I'm afraid that this is another moment when the time does not work in our favor, but we all know that this is a very lengthy process, because making something inclusive, building trust takes time. We know it from our experience with even impact-based forecasting process. Like we've started mentioning impact-based forecasting years ago. we're still not at the end of the way, but at least now we were able to kind of incorporate this notion in everyone's minds, and we all know the mantra about what the weather will do and not what the weather will be. But we need to kind of anticipate this lengthy process, and knowing that at the case of any emergency, at the moment of each hurricane, this trust and this kind of it becomes very thin sometimes. So like this is a very challenging aspect. I think we are now, with all the global attention to this matter, we have a very opportune moment to kind of move the cursor. But I have to say that we need to be very balanced on two fronts. One is not to lose sight of actual actions, because there's a lot of focus on early warning, but it has to be like early warning has to be for early actions, right? So, there's a big argument, and I want to be a little bit deliberately provocative here, but there's an argument to be made between how great the observation network is and how much it should be supported and how much it will actually translate in the action on the ground, because there is debate about it. So putting a lot of efforts in the upstream part of the cycle does not necessarily lead to the early actions. We have to be very mindful of that, especially giving all the attention, including for the recent initiatives. I think the type of solutions that we try to suggest, provide, and support communities have to be supported. It has a lot of behavioral aspects in it, but it has a lot of kind of like responsibility triggering actions. There's a lot that can be done. The community work can be supported. The forecast can be provided. But let's say if we're talking, especially the response, if we're talking about, I don't know, like bluntly evacuation, when after Katrina hit New Orleans, when people were asked why did not you evacuate, they said because evacuation would cost $400 and I didn't have them. So like when action is to evacuate, we need to make sure that the community is covered, that transportation is covered. So like all these kind of like follow-up actions, they have to be part of this picture. And I think this is important to keep in mind. And clearly the digital transformation, because I mean we'll see that the phone stopped being the source of communication, but it's the digital decision tool these days. We know that whether we like it or not, the artificial intelligence will be developing. How we incorporate this? How do we? I mean, visualization of risks and of impact is going to be a big next step. So this all can be and should be incorporated as part of this enabling environment, so to say. Sorry for the wordy response. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Masha. I'll jump a little bit in the script. We are running short on time. So I want to jump to Rahel, because Masha mentioned that sometimes we tend to focus on the observation system and the equipment, but I think most of us in this conversation have a clear picture that doesn't solve the problem, certainly not on its own. You at UN Women, of course, have been doing a lot of work institutionalizing and focusing on institutionalizing leadership of women in particular in disaster preparedness. So I wonder if you could maybe share with us a bit about how, from your perspective, women groups and other community-based organizations and local leaders can help ensure that the early warning systems are more inclusive and effective.
Yes, thank you. And this is such an important question. Well, let me start by saying that the success of any early warning systems relies, of course, on a foundation of trust and strong connection between the implementers and communities, the communities that they seek to reach. And this comes with a need for strong ownership and buy-in, of course. The more inclusive and tailored an early warning system is to the local context, the more likely in the end it is to be effective. And this is, of course, also recognized by the target G of the Sendai framework, which aims to substantially increase the availability and access to early warning systems by 2030. And in line with this, existing examples of successful women-led early warning systems have very much relied on the engagement of local women and their organizations throughout the entire life cycle of developing and implementing early warning systems. So women really need to be engaged by the relevant national authorities and technical bodies to shape early warning systems. So it's not only about reaching women, it is about women being able to shape early warning systems and help make climate-related and disaster information really easily understandable. So that's not a question just of language, it's a question of terms, simplifying terms, and so women need to be able to contribute and also be engaged in dissemination and outreach, of course. And their lived experiences and traditional knowledge do enable them to contextualize this information in a way that makes the most sense for women as well as their communities. So this engagement, of course, also needs to be supported by policymakers in terms of making laws and policies, as well as annual budget allocations for more gender responsiveness and ensuring that the composition of decision-making bodies include women, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. Engaging local women's groups and other community-based organizations also saves time and resources because they tend to have the best knowledge of all community members and can identify also those from marginalized groups who may require extra or specific support and whose needs and risks are not sufficiently well addressed yet. Women understand best which communication channels would be most effectively utilized in reaching them, including, for instance, through bulk SMS in areas with high mobile phone usage, but also other communication systems, such as billboards or two-way radios or more informal word-of-mouth systems, which also are essential for inclusive and gender-responsive early warning systems. It can take years to build the type of community relationships, connections, and knowledge that these stakeholders already have. And that is why it is so important to engage existing community and women's organizations. And let me also maybe make a last point. I know we're running a bit late, but the importance of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data is really critical here. So of course, sex, age, and disability disaggregated data is also really critical to help shape early warning systems, and women's organizations play an essential role in that context as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And to stay a little bit in this, I would say, I don't know, dichotomy between technology and people, I want to go back to Cecin and ask you whether or if from your experience you could elaborate on how technological advances can help create more inclusive early warning systems, and maybe briefly also talk about some of the potential risks for further exclusion that relates to those technologies that we sometimes, or that we often try to introduce.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to maybe highlight a few examples on using technological advances in our programs and the opportunities and challenges we faced and many lessons learned. I want to give example of observation and forecasting, and we talked about women leadership in every part of early warning system, not just receiving the warning and taking action, but also being leaders in producing of early warnings and forecast. We partner with National Meteorological and Hydrological Services and the World Meteorological Organization to advance capacity on monitoring warnings of flash floods through our flash flood guidance system program, which is implemented in 67 countries. The system is uses advanced technology using remote sensing in situ data and forecast models that requires multi-step trainings of forecasters and national authorities. As you may all know, hydrometeorology is a male-dominated profession, in the program, we work with female forecasters to increase their leadership as a producer of forecasting warnings. Participation of female forecasters in the program, both trainings and variety of meetings, improve their capacity to prepare and issue warnings in their countries, as well as strengthen their role on the working place. However, there are still many challenges for female forecasters to attend in-person trainings and meetings, especially events outside of their countries, because of social norms and roles and responsibilities. Introduction of virtual meetings because of COVID in 2020 presented a great opportunity and increased participation, both the participants from the developing countries, as well, especially increased participation of female experts and increasing their capacity. We rely on internet as a technology, and it's a great way to bridge trainings. However, there are still over a third of the world's people do not use internet. Many of them also live in LDC, SIDS, and landlocked developed countries. Bridging this gap, we support training of trainers at national and regional levels. We support mentoring of female forecasters, but either female forecasters or other experienced forecasters. In addition, we are working with local universities to develop curriculum and research to increase the cadre of professionals locally. So the access, although there is still limitation, is probably better than just relying on in-person training outside of countries. Mobile phones are heavily relied on, of course, and has contributed to dissemination of early warnings and information, as indicated in the report as well. However, while virtually all urban areas in the world are covered by mobile broadband networks, in rural areas of especially LDCs, there's still lack of mobile signals and access to high band technologies without internet access. Challenges with mobile phones but doesn't only for the access, but it's usually during the disasters, the mobile networks usually the first thing to go down, either through overwhelming of calls or damage to the infrastructure, and it takes time to get back to repairs and get back to the functioning systems, especially in developing world. In dissemination of early warnings, redundancy is key, as report and many of you indicated. Paying specific attention to especially marginalized group is important in this dissemination. TVs, print medias, and radios are usually available in urban areas, but in rural and remote areas, radios are a better medium to communicate and disseminate warnings. We work with community-based radios and commercial radios to increase information on disaster risk reduction, early warnings, and other climate change adaptation efforts to increase the knowledge and have access to especially women, children, and elderly on those topics. They are usually the main listeners of the radio. However, this doesn't really help to reach all the world's population, especially people living in rural areas and very remote areas in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific does not have infrastructure, common communication infrastructure supported by those technologies. We have a program called Chatterbeetle to overcome lack of access to communication technology. The Chatterbeetle is a portable iridium satellite terminal that permits text-based alerts and two-way messages. That's mainly available to emergency managers in remote locations, so they can receive the early warning and tap into the community structure where communication options are limited. The idea of the device come up with helping Pacific region, especially disaster managers, to warn residents approaching tsunamis, especially at night, but also used for sudden hazards such as cyclones. These are some of our efforts to ensure humanitarian and development programs are inclusive as illustrated and articulated beautifully in the motto, nothing about us without us, that basically articulates that no policy and program should be decided by any representatives without full and direct participation of members of community affected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecin. I'm afraid we're coming up against the ending time of our session this morning, so I will start to wrap up. I want to recognize a question from Alice in the chat. I think it's stated for Dr. Fearnley to answer, so we can maybe connect Alice with Dr. Fearnley subsequently, and you can elaborate on the answer to the question. I'm sure there's a short and a longer, much longer version of a possible answer there. But so with that, I want really to thank you all for joining. First of all, I'm quite excited to see the number of participants this morning that have logged on. I want to thank in particular, of course, our partners at the UN Women and USAID and University College of London, Dr. Fearnley, Rahel, and Cecin. Of course, also a thanks to my colleague, Masha, in our Caribbean region, and a thanks to my own teams, both those focusing on inclusion and those focusing on early warning system. And praise you for connecting the dots. Clearly, what I heard in this conversation is that there's lots of knowledge already. Collectively, we know a lot about what works and what doesn't work very well. It also sounds complicated, which means that we collectively need to become better at doing meaningful things in as simple as possible way, because the needs that we need to address as development professionals are enormous. Clearly, there is much more work to do to make significant progress towards inclusive early warning systems. Challenges, as we all know, remain for the vulnerable groups and marginalized groups. Advancing on this agenda will require tenacity and sustained effort, I think it's fair to say, not only in designing the technologies and the observation systems, but possibly much more focus on some of the institutional and behavioral links and organizations, groups that are meant to both benefit from, co-design, use, take advantage of that these systems exist in the first place. So we hope this event has been insightful for most of you, maybe for all of you, certainly productive for me. Again, thanks to our speakers and for all of you for attending. And with that, I wish you all an excellent rest of the day. Thanks a lot.